Good evening, everyone. My name is Brad Haywood. I'm the Executive Director of Justice Forward Virginia. I want to welcome you all to part 6 of Get Informed About Police Reform. It's our summer explainer series where we help non-lawyers and non-criminal justice advocates learn something about the issues that we're facing in terms of our criminal justice system right now. We actually, as the name would suggest, we've had 5 previous events, and they've touched on topics from what the special session is going to cover to police officers in schools, to the assault and law enforcement statute, mandatory minimums, civilian oversight, and a number of other topics. And tonight, because a lot of you had questions that we weren't able to get to in the previous 5 events, tonight we're having a question and answer session. And we're going to be doing this tonight in 2 parts, just so you're aware. So the first part will be, both parts are going to be moderated by our own Ashley Shapiro, and we're joined by Senator Scott Servell and Delegate Don Scott. And we're going to be discussing criminal justice reform more generally, and especially how it's going to go in the special session, which starts next week. Then at 7:15, we're going to rotate our panelists, and we're bringing back Sarah Burke and Johansi Whitaker, who were on our panel for civilian oversight, to answer your questions about that very interesting topic. And with that, I will now turn it over to Ashley.
All right, thank you. So we have, as Brad just said, we have Senator Servell, who is a senator in Virginia, obviously, who's from the Princeton and Fairfax area, and then we have Delegate Scott, who represents Virginia, and we're just going to jump right in. So the first thing we wanted to talk with you all about is talk about the difference between regular session and the special session that we're starting next week on August 18th. So how will the special session be different from the regular session? And Senator Servell, if you'll start us off.
Sure, and appreciate you all having us, myself and Delegate Scott, here one more time, and all the information you all are doing to get out and raise awareness about what we're about to do in our what I think will be a historic session. Special session is very different. First of all, it has a limited scope. We have to adopt a procedural resolution at the beginning, which says exactly the matters that we're allowed to consider. And hopefully we'll have an agreement about that as soon as we get there. But that's the first thing that we have to do. It's just not wide open like everything else. Secondly, the process is very fluid. The special sessions tend to happen a lot faster. There tend to be fewer committee meetings. When we go in, things tend to be more agreed than in a regular session. They also tend to start and stop. A lot of times we don't meet every day. And this one is obviously very unusual because we're in a pandemic. And so we're meeting in the Science Museum. The House is meeting in a basketball arena. I want to know what they're going to do with the buzzer. But we're probably going to have our committee meetings in the Science Museum. We're probably going to be taking our testimony virtually. It's all going to be very, very, very different than what we're used to. And so the session is going to start Tuesday. It might not end it might end in 2 weeks. It might end in 4 weeks. It might end in 6 weeks. There's no clear date it ends. So that's some of the differences.
Do you know what the schedule is going to be like in terms of how frequently you're going to be meeting, or is this all just going to be decided next week?
Well, I can speak for the Senate. We've been asking the House for information, but we haven't gotten a lot. Don might know better than me about what the House plan is, but at least in terms of the Senate, our plan is to show up on Tuesday, hopefully adopt the procedural resolution, and then immediately kick into committees, probably Judiciary Committee and Rehab probably on Tuesday, and then Ed and Health, Commerce and Labor and Finance on Wednesday, and then back onto the floor on Wednesday. And the way the legislative process works is a bill can't be passed until it's actually read on the floor for 3 days, 3 full legislative days. And so our hope in the Senate, at least, is to try and be out of there by Friday. So if we can get the bills out of committee and on the floor by Wednesday, we could have the first read Wednesday, second read Thursday, third read Friday, vote it and get it over to the House and go home until they send us something. So that's really about all I know right now. But a lot of this also depends on making sure if the governor needs to get us his budget amendments on time and some other timing pieces that need to work out. But that's right now, I think, what we're talking about.
Delegate Scott, what is happening in the House?
I think Senator Serville laid out their plan pretty well. I think that's a pretty optimistic timeline at best. Uh, I know I was thinking I was waiting on him to wave some fairy dust out there, but to make this happen. But that's probably not going to happen. The House, as you know, I mean, the Senate, the special session is exciting. This is an exciting opportunity. I think we get the chance to do some things that are groundbreaking across the board, criminal justice and housing and healthcare. And obviously, we have to deal with the issues around COVID-19 and the budget and the impact it's had on a lot of families and communities deal with some healthcare issues as well. So I really believe that this is a real opportunity. I think what I'm excited about is that, at least since I've been here um, in the state for a while, is that we have a majority Democrat House and Senate. And to me, it's important that we have as much harmony as possible. Even though we know in the back rooms, making sausage ain't pretty. Anybody that like sausage, you know, if you had to see it get made, you'd never eat it again. So I think that's kind of how I view the legislative process here. We have a very diverse group of legislators on both sides of the aisle, but definitely within the Democratic caucus. And I think, it's very difficult, even though a lot of Republicans may like some of the issues that we deal with, especially around criminal justice reform. It's always difficult to get them to go out publicly and say something. Um, Delegate Campbell, not Ronnie, but the other one. I always remember Ronnie, but I forget the other one's name. But it's two Campbell. The other Campbell introduced some earned time credit legislation last cycle, and he allowed his bill to be rolled into my bill. So he was supportive of increasing earned sentencing credit. And so I know, and he believed in it. So I know that we have some support over there. So I think, you know, it's important for the folks who are in charge now, the Democrats, because when the Republicans were in charge, they did what the hell they wanted to do, and they didn't think twice about what the minority thought, and you get in where you fit in. And so now I think the Democrats have the authority and the ability. When you get power, you need to use it and use it to undo some harm and to shape the future the way that we want it to be diverse for everyone. So I think it's an opportunity for the Democrats to get on the same page, and I'm hopeful that we'll you know, continue to put some pressure on some colleagues, but make sure that we call out and give room for people to grow and come into our position. You got to remember, that's the last thing I'm gonna say. We have to remember that when President Obama, who everybody thinks this big liberal progressive was running initially, he was not for gay marriage. He said in the debates, marriage is between a man and a woman. And then, as he says often euphemistically, he evolved. He evolved on the issue. So we have to give folks some education, some time, hopefully, to evolve. And I think where we are right now, folks are evolving, and I think we have an opportunity to get some things done. I think we have to be very careful about putting pressure on and giving folks the opportunity to come our aid. I put a lot of pressure on folks, and we can talk more about it as we move forward. But I try to put a lot of pressure on people because I'm really not interested in your sentimentalities about how you feel about stuff. I only care about how you vote, and that's it. And so how you vote is everything. And you show me how you feel when you vote the right way, or at least the way I think you should.
I think you said that to me the other night.
I probably didn't use my language. Is probably a lot more colorful.
And Delegate Scott, you mentioned the pressures and everything that you guys are getting from the outside and the inside. And the House has already had the 3 committee hearings that actually allowed for public comment. Do you know going forward if there's going to be public comment in the committee hearings once you all start, or how is that going to work?
From my understanding right now, they're trying to put a mechanism. This is only from what I've heard, and seen. I know we're going to do some committee meetings. We have to have public hearings, and we may have a way for folks to sign up the way we did on the committee hearings before. That's what we're hoping, because we know we need some public input and some public feedback. And one of the things that I think I always say this, the opposition to the things that we want to do, they're very organized, they're very strategic, they know how to make the emotional connections for people, especially around fear of the other. And so we have to be very, very, because we're all believers a lot of times, and we're in our own cocoon. And so I think we can be a little insensitive and think, not knowing how to communicate with folks that don't always agree with us. So I'm hopeful that as we move forward, we can be as strategic about who speaks. One of the things that I notice when we have hearings, we'll let any doggone body free. I'm like, they supposed to be helping me and I'm not feeling the love. So I mean they killing my bill, but they supposed to be helping me. So I think we gotta be a lot, a lot more strategic, especially in the advocacy community, about who stands up and speaks on behalf of our issues. Because the people that we think are that we put up to speak, they can kill your bill, like literally not be helpful. And so I'm hoping that, but the other side, most of the time they're coached. They know exactly what to say. They stay on script. And I'm hopeful that we'll get to that point as sophisticated as they are. Now that we're in power, we hadn't been in power long enough to know how to do that yet. So I think a lot of folks are still behaving as though they're in the minority and we're actually in the majority. So we need to start behaving that way.
And Senator Sorrell, do you know what the Senate's planning on doing in terms of public comment and if it'll be in person versus virtual?
It will not be in person. I believe the current plan is that the committees will meet in the Science Museum somewhere. We might go back to Pocahontas, but the testimony is all going to be taken remotely. So there'll be some sort of process, I guess, where you either go into a queue or a waiting room or something, and then you get called in by the chairman. So that's the plan right now. But the public comment process is absolutely critical to the legislative process. So I think no later than Friday, you'll probably be hearing our announcement about when our committee hearings are going to be, and probably further information about exactly how to do comment. But I'll just also note, though, that it's not uncommon that we actually limit public comment once a hearing has begun. So I don't, it's not clear to me exactly how many bills we're going to have to push through in the timeframes that we have, but sometimes the chairman will allocate 10, 20, 30 minutes to, or sometimes it's 10 or 15, 20 minutes to one side, 10, 20 to the other. And whoever's at the head of the line gets to speak, and hopefully they don't talk too long and make it impossible for anybody at the end of the line to speak. But we have to do some efficiency stuff, and back when we had people in a room, we could say, everybody here in support, raise your hand, everybody opposed, raise your hand, or something like that, just to get a sense of the room. And or we tell people, just come up and say support, oppose, and who you represent. So we have to do some things to expedite comment, but there definitely will be public testimony taken.
And Senator Sorrell, the Senate already came out with an agenda a couple of weeks ago. In the meantime, you've been caucusing, bills have been flying about. Do you have any sense on how much of that agenda is going to come forward, or what bills are actually going to be proposed over the summer?
Everything that's on that list is getting proposed, Don. Everything. If anything, the list has grown, but not by a lot. There's been a few things added since we put out our press release. Our bills have been drafted for probably about 3 weeks now, and we've been circulating them to stakeholders to try to get feedback from affected groups so that we don't have to do as much surgery in committee as we're used to doing to try and expedite this. So some of these bills are already on their second, or some are on their second, like the omnibus police reform bill is already on a second or third draft now, or who knows how many drafts we've been through on that, but that one is big. Some of the others, like the bill to give prosecutors more discretion to drop or to work out plea deals or to drop cases. I mean, that went through one draft. The bill has been introduced before. We didn't have to go back and rewrite it or whatever. So we've been doing a lot in the last 3 weeks to try and get these bills vetted and ready to go, so that when we show up on Tuesday, we can shoot them right out of committee and get them onto the finance committee and on the floor. The most complicated part is the financial vetting, because once you put a bill out, it has to be vetted by the money people to figure out if it's going to cost us anything. And sometimes that slows things down or takes more time. And that could be a little bit of a roadblock, but we'll see.
Are you finding any bipartisan support for any of these?
Yes, that's probably one of the biggest differences between the House and the Senate. When it comes on criminal justice reform, there is, I think, a lot more interest on the Republican side towards working towards reforming things. Many of the lawyers in our chamber have done criminal defense and have, I think, an understanding of some of the shortcomings of our current system. And we passed some of the bills that we passed under Republican reform bills we passed under Republican Senate. We couldn't get through the House last year. And
Hey.
so,
Stop that.
okay. Well, I'm just saying that there have been proposals. We do have Republicans. I mean, Tommy Norman carried the expungement bill last year. Bill Stanley, Mark Peake had expungement bills. So and the Republicans have actually reached out to us and asked us if there's ways we can possibly work together this special session on some stuff to get some bills they can vote for. And in the House, it's just the Republicans on the House side are just very much more law and oriented as a group, especially their leadership. And so I think you'll see more bipartisan stuff on our side than theirs. But I mean, Jeff Campbell, I've known, I got to serve with Jeff for 2 years when I was in the House, and he's definitely open to things. But there's fewer members over there on the Republican side that you can work with.
I think there are some who are empathetic, and as I said, empathy only goes so far. I won't vote, and I think they're empathetic and they want some things. They probably agree with some things, but they probably don't feel like they could win in their primary. So they have to be very careful how they vote. Uh, as you know, this is a great time to be a senator because you don't have to run in 21, so you can be courageous. But folks who have to be on the ballot in the House of Delegates, we got to run in 21. So people have to be a little bit more careful about how they do things. And I think that's why we don't have as much bipartisanship. I'm going to talk about the expungement issue that Senator Serville brought up too. You know, one of the things that we did last session is they wanted to expunge. A lot of that was around the marijuana charge. And a lot of folks had issues with that because that would affect one category of folks, but it wouldn't hit enough people. And that's why we're hopeful this time that we can be more comprehensive with expungement. And I'm hopeful that the Senate will support an automatic expungement bill that'll affect a whole lot of folks. I know those are the issues that we need to talk about because I deal with clients who, and when I say automatic, I'm not just talking about automatic. I'm talking about automated. And I mean, we have a antiquated expungement system. Anybody that knows we do it, it takes 4 steps, fingerprints, go down to the courthouse, get the final order. They got to go get fingerprints at the sheriff's or at the police station, send them into the state police. State police got to do something. I mean, it's the most burdensome expungement system. Probably, I mean, I imagine there's some other southern states that are just as bad, but they all do it for one reason, and it's to make it very difficult. And it affects your ability to earn a living. It affects your ability to do all of the things that you want to do, especially if I'm talking about this, and right now, Virginia, you can only expunge stuff that's been dismissed for no profit. So it's not like they're doing a whole lot with the expungement process as it stands. But even to get the stuff that you were innocent of expunged, you got to hire a Scott surveyor. You got to hire a lawyer. So it's ridiculous. So I think we need to think about how we make the system automatic and automated when it comes to expungement. And I think I don't want us to be in a position where we're helping those who have the means to get expunged stuff and not helping those who would just blow it off and they've been doing it so long right now. So I think there's some opportunities to do some real comprehensive stuff with expungements, and hopefully that will come out this session. I feel confident that we'll get something that we will all be proud of, that Senator Serville will not be throwing shade at the House this last time. He'll be jumping up and down, cheerleading the House for having a much more comprehensive expungement bill than that staunch liberal Tommy Norman that he's congratulating over and over.
And Delegate Scott, it's actually a really good transition to some of the concrete proposals that are on the ground. You just spoke about expungements. One of the focuses of the summer, besides the budget and COVID-19, is police training and procedure. And that's going to be what we presume to be a big focus this summer. Can you discuss this focus and how that's actually going to affect reform and if it's going to have a consequential impact actually on the ground?
I think, and the senator will probably speak on this too. They have some great ideas in their bill as well, in their omnibus bill. It's only 34, 35 pages if you enjoy reading big bill. About how many? About 20,000 lines of that thing. But
1,000. Yeah.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, um, I think, we're all pushing for training, de-escalation, and techniques. We're all looking at ways to train on cultural bias, what I call the low-hanging fruit. I think the more difficult stuff is how do we take out the protections that some of the officers who misbehave have. I know people keep saying about bad apples. I don't believe in the bad apple theory. I think you have a culture in place or you don't, and that culture rewards good behavior, and it disciplines bad behavior, and expels it if necessary. So I think we have a culture right now. If you even think about the criticism that we're getting of officers now, the first thing you do when you criticize is that they have a siege mentality. They don't see themselves as public servants. They don't see themselves as guardians of the public. And I think we have to change the culture in the police force. And I think we're going to do some concrete steps. And I talked about this last time, the Law Enforcement Procedure Guarantees Act. I mean, that is an entitlement act all day long. If a lawyer messes up, we have malpractice insurance. If a doctor messes up, we get sued. If a doctor messes up, we get sued. If a police officer messes up, they get to pick one person that they want to evaluate them. Then the agency picks a person. Then those two together pick the person. And they like, well, because we need people who understand what we do and how we have to make split-second decisions and how difficult our jobs are and blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, we call those jurors. All right. We call those people jurors. So, doctors who are working on brains and hearts, they get second guessed by the dude who's pouring concrete in the construction job one week, and he comes on and becomes a juror, and we pick him and we educate him, and he decides whether something was wrong or not. And they shouldn't be no different. So I'm hopeful that we'll get some things to deal with qualified immunity, not just the training, but holding localities and holding officers accountable if that's necessary. And the people that are good officers, they're going to welcome that scrutiny, just like we all do, and there'll be some other ways to move forward. Hope I answered part of your question.
Absolutely.
Fairvale says, no, you didn't answer any of her questions. Go ahead. So I'm in the house.
No, you got it.
Can I just want to chime in real quick. So one thing that I've noticed that the Senate, it's definitely reflected in the Senate bills. I'm not sure about the House yet because we haven't seen drafts, but we believe that, when you talk about the mission, or you talk about the culture or the identity of a police department, the culture or the identity of any agency or organization comes from its mission. And the mission of a police department is defined by the laws they have to enforce. So if all we're worried about, if all we focus on is this culture without focusing on the mission, I think we're going to fail. Because the fact of the matter is these laws, it's impossible to enforce many of them in a racially neutral way, or in a way that is not going to result in cases of excessive force or police misconduct. So, and they all, by the way, all the things we're talking about right now, a large majority of them come from the same place, which was the war on drugs. No-knock warrants to mandatory minimums, you name it. The police militarization, things like that, pretextual policing, that's all the war on drugs. Until we start rolling back some of those laws that define the mission of the police department, I think it's going to be difficult to really see really substantial change.
Scott, your turn.
Well, I mean, Brad, I think you're right about that, but it's really hard in a special session to dive into things that sort of go that deep or that big, because it decriminalization of or defelonization, for example, of drug possession takes a lot of open heart surgery on the code, and to do that properly, it takes a lot of study and planning and hearings and stuff like that. We just don't have time for that in a special session. So a lot of the criminal justice reform stuff we're doing are sort of smaller shots. The police reform bill is actually a pretty substantial change, and that one's going to take a lot of time in our hearing. But I mean, I agree with you about your broader point, but this is why, for example, we have sent the reinstatement of parole to the Crime Commission to be studied, and that's why we also sent the resolution I put in to study every mandatory minimum in the state. We sent that to the Crime Commission. The Crime Commission also was sent the death penalty, although it's not going to look at that. But there's the big stuff, and actually a truly massive comprehensive expungement reform, I think, would take a lot of study, a lot of work. And one other study we're doing right now, which nobody's even talked about, is we have a barrier crime study. We set up a joint resolution to study doing something about barrier crimes. And actually, Delegate Scott was on the conference committee for that resolution during session. And
Senator, can you explain what you mean by barrier crimes?
There's over 1,000 prohibitions on doing different kinds of jobs contained in the code for various different criminal convictions. And so I mean, even things that are just misdemeanors can prevent you from, for example, being able to volunteer at your kid's preschool, or be a child care provider. You know, a $201 grand larceny from 1977 can prevent you from being a realtor or something. So some states have created processes where you can get these barriers lifted. Other states have just lifted them, and so we're taking a look at figuring out a way to make it easier for people to become employed if they can show that they've rehabilitated themselves and whatever they did however long ago isn't really a factor in their life anymore. So it's sort of a species of the expungement problem. To some extent there's some overlap, but the barrier crime piece has more to do with your inability to get employment from a conviction.
Just getting back to what you were, I didn't mean what I said as a criticism of any of the proposals the Senate had made. Actually, I think the Senate proposals are great. And I understand that the focus is fairly limited and it has to be sort of police reform oriented, but there are some really great ideas already that are being proposed, sort of ending pretextual policing and over policing of, well, everyone, but especially communities of color. And then I think civilian oversight is another really big one. And the drafts that I've seen of that legislation look great. And that's where you get at the way the laws are enforced at the local level. And you can have, the community telling their local police department, we don't want you to do stop and frisk in our neighborhoods. We don't want you pulling people of color over for equipment violations. So I do think you're doing good work. And but I understand, obviously, that a lot of these broader things, certainly they're a real big, heavy lift. So might have to wait till later.
Yeah, I mean, after the policing reform thing, I think probably the two most transformational bills that are out there is probably the earned sentence credit, for which Delegate Scott's been a leader on, or expanding Virginia's existing earned sentence credit for people in prison, and then secondly, the abolition of jury sentencing. Those two are probably the most transformational, and then maybe giving prosecutors more flexibility on their plea deals is probably the third in terms of if you were to rank them in order of bigness. Earned sentence credit is up there, though. I mean, if Don's bill that he introduced last year passes, you're talking about 6,900 people being affected pretty fast. So.
And Delegate Scott, are you proposing that bill this summer, or is it going to wait until the January session?
Oh, I'm 100%. I'm 100% introducing this bill again. I have been fighting for this bill. I know there are a lot of great bills out there, and this is one of those that I am heavily invested in because I think you cannot do police reform, criminal justice reform without purposely, intentionally correcting the harms that have been caused. Those people who are in jail right now, they have been harmed some of them. I went to prison a couple of weeks ago, and I talked to some folks who was their first time in prison. Nobody was hurt, nonviolent, been in here 7, 8 years, doing everything right, rehabilitated, ready to go, ready to come out and try to make a life for themselves. And they get, if they do everything right, they get 4.5 days a month if they're level 1, 3 days if they're level 2, 1.5 if they're level 3, and none if they're level 4. And what I'm proposing is to give more days for those folks who are doing the right thing if they hit level 1. So they would get a lot more days for level 1, and then they get more days if they were consecutively level 1. And so it can really impact their sentence. What DOC and others have said, I call them opponents of justice. They said, you know what? Too expensive. The budget is too expensive. They're spending $2 billion on DLC, another billion and a half on local jails, but they don't have money to do this. And it's just, and they don't show, they gave my fiscal impact, I want to say Cerebral probably knows the number off the top of their head because they all scared, $12.5 million or something like that. They, so, because they're saying, but they're not taking any savings off the top, talking about how many, Lawrenceville, where I went, had 1,500 inmates. We're talking about 30 grand a pop on average, just or lower it down to 20 if you want to. But whatever number that is, just they estimated that it'd be maybe 6,000 people affected and maybe released by this bill because they get more credit for time. So we're talking
Delegate Scott, I don't want to cut you off, but we want to get some of our other topics in the short time. One of the
go on and on this issue.
It's a great bill. Yeah. One of the things you just mentioned was repairing some of the harm of people that were already harmed by the system. A lot of this session is actually also focusing on preventing interaction with the police in the first place. So I'd like to move on to pretextual policing. If you could just describe really what the term driving while black is and what can be done to end that practice this summer in this session.
I mean, I can give you an example from this weekend. I'm at home minding my own business. I get a call from a young lady, a former client I represented. I think I even got Fairville a picture of it. Kid is driving back home and he has a flag, a Puerto Rican flag hanging from his rearview mirror. And the police officer pulls him over. He's not obstructed. I can see it. He said he sent me the picture. The officer pulls him over and charges him with driving with an obstructed view and then begins the whole process of searching, pulling him out of the car, the whole 9 yards. And that is the beginning of, that's just one of the many things that you can get stopped by. You can get stopped for having the tail light around your license plate, the bulb goes out. They'll stop you for that. So these are so much of what I would call subjective stops. And guess who gets stopped the most? Even up there in latte liberal land in Northern Virginia, y'all make sure y'all lock y'all black people up. So y'all lock up more than y'all fair share. So in all of these places where we talk about Southwest Virginia, no, don't send me to Northern Virginia. I'm okay. I talk my way in Southwest Virginia. Do not send me to Fairfax, Arlington, or Alexandria. They locking up way more brothers up there. Maybe not per capita, but they ones loading it up. So and I'm sure Scott Silvell and Brad can talk about some of their horror stories, but those are the type of pretextual stops that the officers just get to make up their mind. I think he looks suspicious. Let me pull him over. And those are the things that I agree with Bradley about that we need to take out of the code because officers get the opportunity to play into their own stereotypes.
Senator Sorrell, in the bills that have been drafted, there are some of these what we call equipment violations that are listed that would make it so an officer could not stop someone solely for that. The counter argument to that would be either financial, that honestly makes the Commonwealth a lot of money, or that there's a public safety concern. If someone's tail lights out, it's a safety concern. Can you address those concerns and how that could affect the bill?
Yeah, well, in our body, the pretextual policing, racial profiling bill is being carried by Senator Lucas. And I haven't really heard a lot of negative feedback about it. It basically covers a couple different things. Number one, it gets rid of the dangling. It makes a bunch of offenses secondary offenses. That is, you can't be stopped for them. You can be charged if you're stopped for something else. If you're stopped by speeding, you could get charged, but you can't get stopped for that thing alone. So we want to make the dangling objects a secondary offense because our Court of Appeals found that if you have a parking pass hanging on your rearview mirror, that you can be stopped. We want to make tinted windows, loud exhaust a secondary offense. We want to make the license plate light that Delegate Scott just described a secondary offense. Any type of equipment violation that is not a state inspection requirement, a secondary offense. So, an officer, there's certain things that could be wrong with your car that aren't covered. And the most important one is we also want to pass language that says you cannot be searched, either your person or your car cannot be searched based on the odor of marijuana alone. Now that we've made marijuana a civil infraction, it's no longer a crime, a misdemeanor. I cannot tell you how many how many times, I've had a client who's said that the officer said they smelled marijuana and they hadn't been smoking. And I have a case right now. Young African-American man comes over from PG County with his Maryland plates, driving through, Arlington to pick somebody up, and stops at around midnight, stops at a light. Officer looks at him, immediately lights him up and said, "Your windows look dark." And next thing you know, I smell something, and the whole car is being taken apart. And it happens all the time. And you take away the tinted window, they have to find a violation of law to stop that car. And with the dash cams and the body cams, it's not easy just to make up stuff anymore. You have to be able to show why you stopped that car and you had a good reason. And so these things will make us safer. It'll minimize people's encounters with law enforcement. It'll minimize these opportunities for conflict that are currently happening. The state trooper who arrested, I think, one of my constituents, he was either my constituent or Senator McPike's constituent, and took him out of his car by his neck. That started out as I think a bad inspection sticker. And then they said they smelled marijuana, wanted him out of the car. And he's like, "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm staying in my car." It resulted in him being pulled out of the car by his neck and thrown on the ground and have 3 troopers banging on, beating him up. So those are the kinds of things we're looking to minimize.
And that's actually a great transition, because what often happens is someone stopped for one of these pretextual reasons. Maybe they smell marijuana, and then it can very often lead to some sort of a use of force. So I'd like to talk now about the Senate and then the House proposal with regard to the current assault on a police officer statute. There's been talk about defelonizing it. There's been talk about getting rid of the mandatory minimum. Can you tell us briefly where that is and what you're hoping will happen with it?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if the House is going to put a version in. I've talked to a couple folks, and again, we don't know exactly what their plan is going to be, but it'd be great if somebody does. But right now, since 1990, it's actually kind of ironic, but until 1997, police officers were treated like everybody else when it came to assault and battery. It was a misdemeanor. And I don't think a lot of people realize that felony malicious wounding of a law enforcement officer has a 2-year mandatory minimum. The way assault and battery became a felony for a law enforcement officer became a felony is that in 1997, Congressman McEachin was trying to make assault and battery on somebody because of their race, sex, or religion a felony. And the only way he could get the votes to do it was to add law enforcement officers to that. And so the law until 1997 was different. And the bill that we have right now basically says that it doesn't become a felony. A law enforcement officer victim of an assault and battery or an assault doesn't become a felony unless there's a visible physical injury. And the reason we chose that threshold is that, according to the state police's report, out of the 1,900 cases where law enforcement officers were victims, including malicious woundings, 70% of them involved no injuries at all to the victim. 25% included minor injuries and 5% had serious injuries. And those are obviously all malicious woundings. The 25% probably fall between malicious wounding and A and B. So that's the current proposal. We're also exploring language that would require a cooling off period and an investigation by an officer beyond the officer who claimed they were assaulted and approval by a Commonwealth attorney. Because this is the only charge on the books of all the different crimes we have in our books. This is the only one where the same person is the victim, the lead investigator, the charging officer, and the lead witness at trial. The reason we don't do that for every crime is it's a massive conflict of interest to decide how to charge something when you're the victim yourself. So we usually leave it to an independent police officer to make those judgments, or the Commonwealth attorney to make those judgments. And so I think by doing some of these things, we're going to minimize the use of that charge, because a lot of this is just police officers just getting furious and angry about somebody not being compliant. And they say, "Oh yeah, well, I'm going to hit you with a felony, assault on an LEO and string you up on a 6-month mandatory minimum and cover up the over aggressive policing." So that's,
and then everybody take the misdemeanor assault.
Yeah, right. Because who's going to risk 6 months in jail on a felony,
right,
for slapping a wrist, or they got hit by an onion ring or whatever? So that's right.
Delegate Scott, there's been a lot of testimony. Well, I have 2 questions. One would be, if you are aware, is there going to be a bill in the House? And 2 would be, in the House testimony, there was a lot of testimony from police widows, people police officers who have been legitimately harmed.
Mhm.
And the counter to changing this statute is, of course, that police will be put in harm's way, that they will be opened up to injury. Can you respond to those claims, which seems to be the biggest opposition to this type of bill?
I'm not sure if the House will have a bill. That's one. And two, I think the law already allows for the protection of officers without that special class and category. And I think that's one of the things that I continue to see as a theme, whereby we treat law enforcement officers different than other occupations who are held accountable for things. It's as though, I know these guys are, and ladies and women are not as fragile as we would have them to believe. I know it's a dangerous job. All right. It's a very dangerous job. But folks sign up to do it. They swear an oath. Uh,
Think we briefly lost them. Brad, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about how the assault on a police officer statute then connects with actual police violence against the defendant?
Yeah, so there's sort of a disturbing pattern when there are accusations of excessive force against a police officer. Those are often accompanied by a assault on law enforcement charge. And, I think part of the reason is cynically, the bad cops, if they charge that offense, they want to raise the stakes against the defendant so they can get some kind of conviction. So then they can insulate themselves against civil liability. Because if a defendant who was arrested, and during that arrest claimed excessive force, if that defendant ends up convicted of something, there's a 0% chance they're going to be able to win a lawsuit against that officer.
I started talking about race and I got cut straight off. Y'all are good, boy.
Yeah, I was done. So where were you?
Poor timing.
No, I'm joking. I'm saying somebody on the controlling the Facebook thingy. But no, I'm just saying though, I just think, a lot of that stuff around protecting law enforcement has to do a lot with race. I'm gonna leave it at that.
And you know what? It's one other thing I want to point out is that there's also been a lot of misinformation put out. People have been saying, well, if you have a visible physical injury standard, then what about internal injuries? What about concussions? The Virginia Court of Appeals has found that constitutes malicious wounding. So like if somebody hits somebody 4 or 5 times, that shows an intent to injure. That's malicious wounding as a 2-year mandatory minimum. Other people have said, what about these protesters throwing things? I said, well, if it's a bag of human waste or if it's a bag of glue, I think that's probably an assault and battery. But if somebody's throwing a brick or a bottle, sharp objects, that's attempted malicious wounding. That's a felony. So always has been, always will be. Nobody's proposing to change that. All we're talking about here are situations where something happens and an officer is not hurt. Like there's some minor contact and is not hurt. And it's really just changing the punishment. We're not trying to substantially change the law tremendously here.
Okay, so we're running low on time. We got some questions from the Facebook audience, and I want to go over these quickly, sort of quick hitter questions. I know we talked about the good time bill already. If you had to, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 no chance, 10 definite chance, what are the chances we get a good time bill passed this special session, Delegate Scott?
I'm very optimistic. That's all I can say. So I'm gonna say an 8. That's high.
I like it. I
say an 8 because I think this is a time where folks need to understand this is an opportunity. If we really truly believe in rehabilitation, it should be a no-brainer. I don't care if you're Republican or liberal, or Democrat. It should be a no-brainer.
Great. This one's for Senator Serbell. Is there any interest in taking up a pretrial reform or cash, ending or modifying cash bail in the special session, or is that going to wait?
That was not part of anything on the Senate agenda, and I'm not aware of any senator that's carrying that kind of bill. If a bill comes over from the House that does it, then we'll have to consider that. But I don't know what they're proposing, so that's not part of our plan. But
I imagine you'll prioritize it in January, right? Though. Okay, great.
Yeah.
And for either of you, a question about qualified immunity, can that be addressed at the state level? And what are your plans for doing something about
We that's a division between the houses, I think.
it? Okay.
Well, in other words, let me put it this way: there's two state delegates, Delegate Jones and Delegate Bourne, have publicly stated they're putting a bill in. They said that about 2 months ago, and I haven't seen the draft yet. But we looked at it in the Senate. Senator Morrissey, Senator Peterson wanted to do something about it, but once we started looking at drafts, it got really complicated really fast, and we were worried about unintended consequences. So, for example, in Colorado, they created civil action for violating the Constitution of Colorado. And the problem is, if we do that in Virginia, there's a lot of things in our Constitution that other states don't have. Like, we have the whole victims' rights provision. We have the right to hunt. We have the Marshall-Newman Amendment. And there could be lots of unintended consequences if you have everything in the Constitution, or if you make it broader than law enforcement activities. And, Section 1983 is already broader than just law enforcement. So, we're open to talking about it, but it's a very legally complicated thing to accomplish. And I think we'll probably see something out of the House. Don probably knows better than me about that, about whether they can get something out.
I think the goal is to get something out. I'm sure that Delegate Bourne and Jones can adequately defend their own bill, but I know that their intent is to do something to eliminate the qualified immunity exception and hold folks accountable when they do such egregious things that the qualified immunity statute clearly says the Supreme Court basically, okay, so qualified immunity was put in place as a result. Don't get mad at me, but the Ku Klux Klan Act is what came into place to be able to sue the government. And so from that, it was watered down to then provide protection for government officials. And that's how we got to qualified immunity. I think there are a couple of things that we can do if we can't go straight to it. And I'm not sure exactly. I haven't read that bill. I've talked to them, and I know we got a lot of ideas. But if you don't want to go specifically at individuals, then there's ways that we can hold localities accountable. Because a lot of times they'll say, we didn't know we hired this guy that shot. And where I am in Portsmouth, we had a guy shoot 2 people, and then he was tried the second time. And both times they were unarmed. So I think, and he had some investigators, and he was put back on the street. So I think if a locality had been held accountable the second time, then we probably would see a lot more scrutiny about who gets a badge and a gun and what type of job they get to do on the street. Because it's a tough job. I mean, I don't think anybody that I know in the House wants to abolish the police force. So when I hear that kind of stuff, I don't even feed into it. And I don't think anybody wants to think that we don't need law enforcement, but we want good law enforcement. We want guardians in our community that see themselves first and foremost as members of the community. There was an article here recently where we had like 25% of the police force, they don't even live here. So they don't care about our community. They don't care about our concerns. They don't know the people. They don't shop. They don't go to Little League. They don't go to sporting events. They live in communities outside of our community. So when you have folks like that only view us as the other, they come in, they police us, and then they go home, then this is the only logical outcome is the system that we have right now.
All right, and last question I got here, because Senator Serval, you had mentioned a mandatory minimum study submitted. I think a lot of people don't know much about these studies. And I saw a lot, and quite frankly, I'm wondering also, there's a long list of things that the Crime Commission is planning to study. Are they actually going to get all these done before the 2021 session? And are the things they're going to produce going to be useful? I mean, that's not a lot of time to do some pretty big stuff.
Yeah, things got started late because of COVID. Usually the Crime Commission also, in fairness, the Senate took an extra month or two to put people on longer than we usually do to get people on these commissions, and that delayed things a little bit too. So, but luckily I got on the Crime Commission. However, I'm not on the executive committee, so I don't get to participate in any of the real work. And so, yeah, but they did pick off some really ambitious stuff, and I'm a little bit worried about exactly whether they can cover all that stuff. We luckily though, the majority leader Sharon O'Haring in the House was adamant that they needed more staffing, so both of our last budget got one more staff person in there to do the work for the crime commission. And so they have a little bit more staffing than they've had over the last 20 years to do some of this big stuff. So I'm optimistic, but you're right. And these commissions toil. People don't realize all the work that happens outside of session. And that's when a lot of the really big stuff gets figured out. And it's also important to be involved and show up at hearings and do public comment at some of these commission meetings that meet, or these joint studies like the barrier crime study, so that you can be heard then, because often what comes out of these commissions ends up being the bill, and it's presented as peace in the valley and don't make any amendments when you get to session. And so a lot of the work happens, it's like happening right now.
Well, we are.
I'm not on the crime, Brad. I'm not on the crime commission. You'll hear me whining. He's on the doggone thing, and he whining about not doing it. What the hell?
Well, with that, we're a little bit over time, but I think this is really great, and we really appreciate you coming on. Just for everybody watching, we're going to take a very brief break. We're going to rotate panelists, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit about civilian oversight. But again, I just wanted to say thank you to Senator Serval and Delegate Scott, both for being here tonight and also for being tremendous allies of our criminal justice reform movement in Virginia. We really, really appreciate having people like you, so dependable, so passionate, so informed, and so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Very much.
We'll take a quick break and we'll be
Thanks
right
for your
back.
work.
All right, we're back. Brad Haywood again, Executive Director, Justice Forward, Virginia. Ashley Shapiro is still here. And we are now joined by Sarah Burke, who previously joined us for part 3 of Get Informed About Police Reform. She is an expert in Virginia on civilian oversight bodies. And we hopefully very soon will be joined by Johanse Whitaker, who's an organizer with the Legal Aid Justice Center and also a member of the Richmond Transparency and Accountability Project. He's likewise an expert on this topic. And he's having some technical difficulties because of power outages. And I think a lot of you watching might be having the same issues. Thankfully, it's just overcast where I am, but hopefully he will join in so we can, oh, here he is. Look,
Yeah.
we're letting him in. Jack, Johanse is about to join us, so be prepared. All right. So I will turn it over. So Ashley is going to moderate this section as well. So we'll turn it over to Ashley again.
Thank you. So I think one of the things we want to focus on is really making sure people understand what civilian review boards are, the different ways they can be done, and because it's often thought of as a local issue, what can be done at the state level during this summer session. So Sarah, we'll start with you, obviously. So we often think of police departments as enforcing the law, but are they actually doing that? And are they protecting our communities? And should they be held accountable to those communities? You're still muted, Sarah.
Welcome to Zoom. It's a good question, and it's an important question. I think it's one that like communities are grappling with all over the nation right now, is sort of where do our conceptions of public safety come from? What are the sort of doctrines that have created those over the years, and who should keep us safe, and who is best at keeping us safe? And you know, a lot of community groups are asking for you know, first responders to certain calls and certain issues to not actually be people with weapons, saying if you are a police officer showing up to a scene that doesn't warrant having a gun, perhaps you are going to cause more conflict than you do help, especially mental health related issues, some domestic disputes. And so sort of reimagining what public safety looks like and what the community's role is in both caring for each other and also holding the people who we pay their salaries with our tax dollars, holding them accountable for when they are either policing in a way that doesn't meet the standards of the community, or if there's specific egregious conduct that needs to be addressed. And so the main calls that we are hearing here in Charlottesville, where I live, and in collaboration working with Johanse and others in Richmond, there are sort of two major calls for both more transparency about how the communities are policed, specifically communities of color. And so that's access to data, that's priorities, that's funding, that is access to use of force data, stop and frisk, specific community complaints. And then the other issue is accountability. So what can we do to actually hold police officers accountable in a state where we have qualified immunity? And you know, how can we sort of provide some community control over policing in a way that is fair and that is impartial and that actually improves public safety? And so I think people think about civilian review boards. The term is a bit of a misnomer because it gives the sense that you're just reviewing, say, a civilian complaint about one police officer's conduct. But the sort of more modern conception of civilian oversight is that it can do that, of course, but that it can also do more proactive work and be looking at the sort of procedural justice and the ways in which communities are policed, and say, is this actually meeting community need? Is this keeping our community safe, or is this increasing contact with marginalized communities, with people of color, with unhoused people, with people who are at high risk of police violence? And so I'll turn it over to Johanse. He might not have heard the question, which might not be very fair, but hopefully
I can jump in because I was about to ask Johanse kind of the same question. First of all, welcome. Glad you can make it on the call. Johanse, I think that we talked about this in preparing for the call, but unfortunately, a lot of people just, I don't think, internalize really what the problems are with policing, especially from the perspective of people of color and communities of color. We have these entire organizations in our communities, police departments, that ostensibly are established to, protect communities, to, keep them safe. But there are many, especially communities of color, don't feel that that's the way that they are operating. And I think that we need to understand that in order to frame the problem here. And I think the problem is, as Sarah was talking about, is very frequently community leaders, as people living in communities of color, feel like there's no way to explain, or there's no one to hear them out and to do something about what the problems are. Can you discuss that a little bit? The types of problems that aren't being addressed, and the kinds of things you see, maybe a story or an anecdote that would help enlighten some of our listeners.
Sure. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here with you all today. Thanks for the question. I was late. The mighty thunderstorms in Richmond and our power got knocked out, but hopefully I'll be able to, to stay on for the rest of the call. I think, if I were to answer your question, I'd talk about the folks who are currently incarcerated in Virginia's prisons and jails. Recently, reviewed a letter that was sent to our office from someone who is inside a Virginia facility. And they described that people with COVID-19 symptoms are often waiting 30 or more days to receive medical attention. And when people do receive medical appointments, they're transported to the hospital without masks or personal protective equipment. And later on, they're released back into the general population without testing. And this person also stated has started to experience symptoms of virus, but due to judicial closures, they've yet to have their day in court. And so they now sit in jail simply accused of a crime, yet really under a death sentence. And the accused person, likely had no voice in the police policies and procedures that brought about their arrest. They were not given an opportunity to make budgetary recommendations on what they wanted in their communities to be funded. And perhaps, I would make the case, if there were budgetary investments in education, health, jobs, and housing, then the accused person would not be in jail. And so we often talk about, and I shared an example of police misconduct in our last session, but we often talk about civilian oversight mechanisms in ways that would review individual complaints, but we also want to talk about how they can disrupt police policies that lead to mass incarceration. So civilian oversight is a way to give people a voice in budgetary recommendations, how their neighborhoods ought to be policed, so that they then have a voice in that matter. And it's also just one tool that we can use to shine a light on the police policies, their data practices, and their budgets. It just is one step to ending mass incarceration.
And so I would have a question directed specifically at you, because it's something that's happening right now in Richmond. When you're talking about civilian review boards and there being some sort of, as Sarah mentioned, accountability, transparency, Richmond actually recently advertised for a civilian position within the police department to help with some sort of oversight. Can you talk about if there can be any kind of accountability without that independence and being separate from the police structure?
Yeah, we in Richmond, we have a history of the cops trying to pass off independent oversight as civilian oversight. In Richmond, right around the start of the Richmond uprising, our police chief and our mayor got onto the airwaves to say that Richmond already had civilian oversight, and they pointed to the internal use of force review board that the Richmond Police Department has. But what we know, one of our community organizations, the Richmond Transparency and Accountability Project, has researched internal RPD data, and it showed that the stated policy of RPD is that those internal mechanisms will review cases within 30 days, but often, when you review the data, we found that it took upwards of 4 months or more for cases to be resolved. And in Richmond, you can't even lodge complaints against police officers anonymously at the moment. So we have real concerns about, internal oversight mechanisms. The Mayor Stoney also has the Reimagining Public Safety Task Force, where at least 4 people on the task force are police officers, and it also includes the Commonwealth Attorney and a former judge. And what we know is that when you have cops on these oversight boards, they bring in bias, one bias in favor of police officers, and then bias against people who are Black and brown. And so when you have cops on oversight bodies, the racial disparities that we see in policing continue. And it's really important to us that civilian oversight, true, meaningful civilian oversight, is fully independent and external from the floor and chain of command of the police department. So, we have a history of our mayor and police chief trying to pass off these types of internal, oversight mechanisms as civilian oversight, but that's just not the case. That's not what they are.
Just to chime in there about independence, I think sometimes it helps for people to think about other types of organizations that have accountability. You think about a nonprofit or even a for-profit corporation. Those are always going to have boards of directors. And I don't know if anybody watches the television show Succession. Anybody watch that? I love it. But anyway, so it sets up this very classic conflict of interest where the owner, the founder of the company, has packed the board with his family members. And so he does that and makes sure he has enough votes on there that they never actually can hold him accountable. It's an obvious conflict of interest. So you don't want that. If you want a healthy functioning corporation or nonprofit, you need an independent board with, that is not controlled by the executive director. In the same way, by the way, works in the government. You have inspectors general of pretty much every agency of the government. So the military has them. If the military has them, I think that the police can have them. And when you appoint them, it's always somebody who's independent, who's not connected, who's not paid. Salaries aren't paid for by that agency. They can't be hired and fired by the head of that agency. And it's just a good way to operate an organization, especially one nowadays where we're finding out how critical it is that this organization be connected to the community that it's supposedly serving. So just to sort of highlight the importance of independence.
Well, and I just want to add one quick thing to that, which is that we do rely on that. We also rely on that within our criminal legal system. We rely on a set of jurors who are civilians to make determinations about people's liberty and in capital cases about whether somebody should live or die. And so we can trust civilians to, if we can trust civilians with that kind of decision making, I think we can trust civilians with overseeing police departments. And I just want to mention that, we often talk about it as though it is solely a civilian oversight body, and we assume that means it is volunteer only. And I think the best models across the country are sort of a hybrid version that involve people with expertise in, Fourth Amendment analysis or legal expertise, investigative expertise, process, policy, data analysis, people who can be employed by the jurisdiction as sort of the staff that works on behalf of the oversight body that is volunteer based. That's a critical component of this. Like, this is not free work. This is work that volunteers should either receive a stipend to do, or if they're doing it for free, and even if they are doing it for free, there needs to be staffed assistance from independent of the police department that is involved in this process, because it is complicated. And we do believe that volunteer board members should be well trained in understanding police policy and understanding the systems and data collection and analysis in policing, because you cannot oversee a system that you don't understand. But currently the policing systems are so closed, and they're just these sort of black boxes. And even those of us who work in the criminal legal system feel like we're often very unaware. We have sort of pull at the threads to figure out what's going on. There needs to be a sort of bringing to light and an opening up of these systems so that people can do this work properly. And so I get really frustrated when people fault civilians for not having the knowledge that then the police departments themselves withhold.
So Sarah, I don't know, were you reading the Facebook comments as you were talking? Were you?
I don't.
Seriously, someone asked this exact question. You were answering at the time they were asking it. They were saying, you know, I don't trust non-cops or to oversee the cops. You know, Monday quarterback, the police.
Yeah.
But that's why the organizations need to be professionalized. They need to be resourced. They need to be people who are trained, who understand the operations.
And they are professionalized. Like this is an industry that has been in existence since the 90s and has failed in a lot of ways due to some pretty unimaginative creating of these boards, and also, you know, the protections in place in various states, including Virginia, that, you know, provide police officers with extraordinary protections that other public servants don't enjoy. So
yeah, the first oversight bodies were created in what, the 50s or 60s, something like that.
Yes, yeah. There was sort of a new wave in the 90s, and you know, a lot of what Johanse is talking about. It's every time I talk to somebody from another area that's dealing with oversight, I'm sort of both shocked and also not remotely surprised that we're all dealing with the same problems. Like, it's because they are large systemic problems that, you know, no matter the police chief, no matter the officer who you might have a decent relationship with, who, you know, who's you think is a good woman, or, you know, whatever, the systems themselves are so pervasive, and the creation of the oversight body that is actually internal to the police department and is sort of stacked with exactly what Brad's talking about, you know, the folks that are never going to actually rule against them, or are going to not process the complaint or process the investigation in the way that they should. That is part of a larger systemic problem that is occurring everywhere. And I hear Johanse say it, and I said, like, I could have said the same comment about a totally different jurisdiction. And so it is a problem pretty much everywhere. And I talk to people all across this country about it, that if you don't have independent oversight with actual ability to get access to data and documents, and then some sort of teeth, whatever that is, some measure of disciplinary authority, if you want to think of it as that, or accountability. If you make a policy suggestion and the police department reviews it, they have to, or they refuse it, they have to provide reasoning for why. There have to be these sort of checks and balances, because if not, it's just sort of a performative measure like the ones Johanse is talking about.
I don't mean to hog the talking, but just to get, I had another point to make about the, you know, having the questioning of whether we should be Monday morning quarterbacking the police. So I don't think, I mean, again, that's not what's going on, but think about what's happening right now. So I don't know if it's dawned on anyone. We've got a legislature that is a part-time legislature, and proudly a part-time legislature. They usually supposedly work for 60 days a year, and they're paid about $14,000 to $17,000 a year. And in any given session of the legislature, they have about 2,000 bills to consider in 60 days. And most legislators have one legislative assistant to help them get all those bills right. Now, we're trusting them right now to create policy for police departments, for criminal justice system. Nobody thinks twice about that. And it is a flawed legislative process. They require input from groups like ours. But think about what's being asked for here with civilian oversight. We're getting away from that flawed legislative system. We're putting the control over policing of communities, we're putting it into those communities, and we're localizing it. And that's always a better way to do government, especially something as local as this. So it's you know, the criticism, I think, falls flat. I mean, not only are you addressing issues in the community in which those issues are occurring or arising, but you are paying people to have it be their only job or a big part of their life just focusing on this thing, not 2,000 things in a period of 60 days. So to me, this is the right way to address, policing, and that's the reason so many people are so excited about the potential of civilian oversight.
Absolutely. And Johanse, I wanted to ask you a question. Sarah was talking about that one of the main pushbacks is police officers are saying, well, we should police ourselves. No one can understand what we're doing except us, right? And that's been a lot of the testimony that we heard in the House side. And that's been, as Sarah said, everyone else is being policed by other people except the police. What other areas specifically is law enforcement pushing back on in terms of, do they have concerns about the disciplinary authority of the civilian review boards or the personnel authority? Are there specific policies that the law enforcement is opposing?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've seen law enforcement groups disapprove one of just the entire concept of having external oversight, but we also seen them put up resistance to civilian oversight bodies having disciplinary authority. And in all of the research that we've seen, effective civilian oversight bodies must have final disciplinary authority.
Describe what you mean by disciplinary authority, just what that could mean.
Sure, yeah. So, currently, we have civilian oversight bodies who can investigate officer misconduct, and they can make a recommendation to the police chief about what the discipline ought to be to help hold the officer accountable. But it's simply that it's just a recommendation. It's not binding. And so most civilian oversight bodies, like Sarah was saying, are toothless because they can only make recommendations on discipline, but a lot of these, incidents go without any discipline or accountability. And so part of what folks in Richmond and across Virginia have been asking for is for the General Assembly to grant civilian oversight bodies final disciplinary authority, the final say in what happened, to resolve an investigation to hold an officer accountable. And many jurisdictions have the authority to make recommendations to the police chief, but these do not occur within internal affairs decisions, and they are rarely is there additional action taken against the officer who's involved. And that really undermines the benefits of civilian oversight. It undermines the ability to build trust in communities, and it really, in my judgment, there's really no due process there. And so civilian oversight bodies, we know cannot solve all of the problems related to policing, but we hope that they will at least be able to hold officers accountable for their actions, and having officers answer to the public. These are public officers. They are funded by taxpayer money, and they ought to be accountable to the people who pay their salaries. The public also deserves to know which officers have patterns of misconduct. And this underscores the importance of another thing that we've seen some pushback on, which is expanding FOIA law transparency. So this is the type of accountability that serves to, when you have final disciplinary authority and you have FOIA law transparency, those are the types of things that strengthen relationships between communities and police, especially communities who have experienced disparate policing.
And I just want to add to that. Muted my mic again accidentally. I think that people think about final disciplinary authority as though, like, we're going to have civilian oversight bodies just firing police officers left and right, and it's going to be, total mayhem. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that the majority of civilian oversight bodies want to have that more proactive approach to policing, where you're making policy recommendations, where you're reviewing data, where you are analyzing it, where you're reporting that to the public to sort of change the narrative about policing, at least the parts of it that have been kept silent for too long and that have been kind of hidden from the public view. And there are relatively few complaints really filed in most police departments. And some people might say that's because law enforcement officers are doing their jobs adequately. But most of the research shows it's because people don't want to file a complaint with the same person that has allegedly harmed them. And a lot of these are really are sensitive issues. They involve possible racial discrimination or sexual innuendo or sexual assault, or they aren't easy things for most people or anybody to talk about, much less to go to the friend or the supervisor of the person who you're saying did that and then reporting it. So you have relatively few complaints first, just period. Plus, people who are mistrustful of a system that has been harmful to them and their loved ones for generations, just aren't likely to go to the website and figure out what the complaint process is and file, and then wait through the numerous months that it takes for the investigation to go forward. It's not the complaint process is already sort of a broken process. So if we're talking about having final disciplinary authority, most of the time the board sides with the police department anyway in those small number of complaints. That can be because they have very limited access to the data and documents they need to do their work, but it's also just sort of by nature, there are going to be some complaints that are decided to not be determined in favor of the complainant. There are going to be things that are resolved on a criminal level that aren't resolved in the internal affairs investigative process. And so there are really relatively few complaints where we're even really talking about any disciplinary authority. And beyond that, what the state is doing is allowing localities to make that determination. The state isn't saying you have to have binding authority to make disciplinary determinations. The state is saying localities decide whether they want CRBs in the current bill that I've seen. Localities decide whether they want subpoena power for those CRBs, and you are able to give them subpoena power. Localities are allowed to determine whether or not what level of final disciplinary authority these boards should get. And that can include a letter of reprimand. That can include suspension with or without pay. That can include a demotion or mediation that's demanded. There's lots of ways in which sort of the discipline question can be resolved. But I think people always go to this, like the sort of the big scary, oh, what if we have Black people from our community deciding whether or not an officer gets fired. I think in those rare cases, yeah, I think that should be permissible. And I think why are we so afraid of community members who are, if we're asking for it to be, mostly staffed by the people who are experiencing disparate policing and over policing, these are people in our communities who are being actively harmed, and their families and their loved ones are being actively harmed by policing. And to say that, maybe every once in a while, those folks are going to have some say in the policing that occurs, especially with, sort of for the problem officers that are repeating that conduct. To me, that sounds like that's what we should want. We should want those voices in the room making the decisions that say this is actually harming the community and it's making us and officers less safe to have this officer on the force.
And Sarah, we had a question actually from Facebook. If you could just go quickly, how will these citizens be chosen? If we're having them have this power over the police, how would they be chosen, and how have they been in jurisdictions you've seen?
So they've mostly been appointed. So far, we're in a Dillon rule state where the boards, as they are pre-August legislation, are advisory bodies to whoever your governing body is. So for us, it's the city council. For some folks, it's the board of supervisors. So they're appointed by the city councilors or the board of supervisors. There are other
and I'm just asking because I really don't know, meaning the city council or board of supervisors would appoint the people to the board?
Yeah, so at least in Charlottesville, how we've crafted it is that the city councilors make the appointments based on an application that's submitted. We asked for significant public input on that so that the public could provide the guidance as to who the best candidates were for the board, and the city rejected that portion and many other portions of our initial proposal for what civilian oversight should look like. But we did create pretty strict membership criteria that ensures that the people who are experiencing policing, specifically in the Black and Brown communities in Charlottesville, are the ones who have a reserved slot and have some mandated representation on the board. So their appointments can be anywhere for however long you want them to be, however long your locality determines. So a year, 3 years, 5 years. It can involve non-voting members who are from the governing agencies or not. We chose not to. We as a city, Charlottesville decided they didn't want to have a city councilor representative on the board. But we're pretty clear we didn't believe that any police officer who is currently employed at the department it's overseeing should be part of this body. So, my real takeaway from all of this and the legislation drafts that I've been able to read is that the state is not mandating that any locality create anything that the locality doesn't want. It's saying you have the authority to create this type of oversight body if you believe it's in your best interest, which really matches with what the best practices of civilian oversight are, which is that it should be very community driven. It should be based on specific needs within the community, because what works in Richmond might not work in Charlottesville due to a lot of different reasons. And so it should be a process that involves the communities most impacted by policing. And that should be, so it should really be locally driven and not a top down from the state sort of mandate of what oversight looks like. So anything that involves, the Attorney General reviewing some level of seriousness of complaints, I think is a real, it would be something I really wouldn't trust if that's what comes out of this August session as a sort of civilian oversight mechanism, because that's not true to the nature of it and the spirit of it.
Yeah, and I think it's just echoing Sarah. I think it's really important that there are specific seats reserved for people who are Black members of the public housing communities and those communities that have experienced the highest rates of policing in their localities, because those are the people who know policing, and the domination of policing the best, and those are the people who can provide to us the best answers about how to move forward as a society. And really they're the experts in Richmond specifically. Black people, we knew that our communities were being policed differently than in the more white and affluent neighborhoods. And when we went to city council to say that, they told us, show us the data. That data was hidden, and there was a battle to get that data that was 2-3+ years of intense public pressure. But the data showed that for example, from 2017 and 2018, that RPD officers are more likely to use force against Black civilians, and that while the city of Richmond is 48% Black, more than 75% of all use of force incidents involve Black civilians. And so that's why there need to be seats specifically reserved for Black people and other people who experience high rates of policing. Richmond City Council just passed an ordinance, starting this listening stage for us to hear and engage with community members about what civilian oversight in Richmond should look like. And we ran into some legal snags. We asked for seats specifically reserved for Black and Brown people, and the city attorney told us that was not possible. We offered some revisions to that, but they were not accepted, and we had make sure to pass those by our own attorneys. In the end, what we got was a commitment that there would be no official votes of the Civilian Review Board and no official votes of the task force that is building the recommendations without folks who are Black and Brown and experience historically disparate policing.
It's also just really obvious that that's who should be on the board. I mean, if you think about what you're asking for a civilian oversight mechanism to address the real policing problems in your community, to improve public safety, to improve relationships, and to provide some accountability and transparency. And like that has to be the people who have experience with policing. And I feel like we, in a lot of areas, talk around the issue that means having a high percentage of Black and brown and low income and public housing residents. And I think that, yeah, I remember somebody saying in Charlottesville, well, this is a very different board than what we're used to. And the answer is yes, and it should be. It should be a different board, or maybe all these boards deserve a little bit of overhaul. But like, people seem so shocked by the fact that people who are experiencing the most policing should be providing the oversight, and I don't find it shocking at all.
So we're running out of time here, and so I just wanted to thank you again for joining us tonight, and also joining us a few weeks ago. Just, my way of making a closing argument, I'll reiterate exactly what I said at our last event, and you all have covered these same points tonight. In order to solve the problems we have to get ahead of them, not just react to them. I think that's a point that both Johanse and Sarah have made tonight. We can't just be reacting to incidents. We've got to be, anticipating what's going to happen. We know what's going to happen because we've seen it happen over and over and over again, not just in the past few months, but the past few decades. We know that our problems aren't just a few bad apples. We know that our problems are actually institutional, and that we need community input into finding out what the solutions are to those institutional problems. Not only that, we have to have the power to solve those problems. So our groups, the civilian oversight bodies, need to be able to obtain the information they need. They need to be able to obtain the information they need in order to investigate what the institutional problems are. And they also need to be able to make binding recommendations, or at least recommendations that have some force beyond just a simple, recommendation or suggestion. Of course, as we've noted over and over, these bodies, civilian oversight bodies, need to be independent. You can't get into a situation like we talked about at the last event, where we're basically living out the meme, we've investigated ourselves and cleared ourselves of any wrongdoing. You can't have that situation. That's essentially what we have right now with the 3 civilian review boards that are in existence in Virginia. And we have to have civilian oversight that is transparent. It's transparent for the same reasons, so that the community is engaged and so that trust is built, the trust that's been broken over years and years of discriminatory policing and treating communities of color like a battlefield. So this is how we get at the core of the problem. And as we have talked about, we think that this is one of the police reforms that holds the greatest promise, because not only are you dealing with the point of arrest type methods, the processes by which laws are enforced, but you're actually talking about law enforcement priorities in a community, and you're giving the community some ownership about how they are policed, and there also some say over the problems that are occurring in their own communities. So with that, I just want to say thank you again, and thank you to Sarah Burke and to Johanse Whitaker and to Ashley Shapiro. And if you're still watching right now and you haven't tuned out, I would also just like to ask that if you are invested in criminal justice reform, if you want to make this a reality, we can't, we're at the point that this is such a huge issue in Virginia and nationwide. It's not something we can do at a volunteer basis anymore. And we're increasing in capacity. A lot of volunteer groups are. We have a lot more work to do. We have a lot less time to do it, and we really need your financial support. So not only should you follow us on social media or sign up for our mailing list, but if you are able to support us with your finances, we would greatly appreciate it. And so with that, I guess we'll wrap up part 6 of Get Informed About Police Reform, and thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Good night.
Thank you both very much.
thank you for doing all these sessions. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.